Hello, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. I'm Dimitris Papanikolaou. I'm here to welcome you in yet another one of our public webinars, roundtables, meetings. With my colleagues, Christina Getgaudaite and Maria Bolezzi, we have been putting together events such as this one for a year and a half now, or rather a year now, in a network that we have created between the Universities of Amsterdam and Oxford under the umbrella of the Oxford Research Centre for the Humanities, TORCH, which is hosting us today. We are calling our network Rethinking Modern Greek Studies in the 21st Century, a cultural analysis network, and you can read about that in the links that you can find in the YouTube, if you're joining us from YouTube, or in the various other contacts that we have put together and distributed widely. This year, in the context of this particular year, we are running only internet events under the banner Modern Greek Studies and Beyond, Local Cases, Global Debates. Today's is one of those. All of them are easy to find on the internet, so those of you who are watching us for the first time, please go ahead and check our other events. We need to thank Torch first of all, and Anbara Khalidi for hosting us and providing support. We also need to thank the Marilena Laskaridis Chair in Modern Greek at the University of Amsterdam and the Faculty of Byzantine and Modern Greek at Oxford, as well as our funders, the Ekaterina Laskaridis Foundation, Torch, the University of Oxford, and as of recently, the Modern Greek Studies Association, which has given us a special grant to update and upgrade our presence online. I'll now give it to my colleague, Christina Girgaudaite, who will present and chair today's event. Thank you all for joining.
Hello and a very warm welcome to everyone who is joining us today from wherever you are. My name is Christina Getgaudaite and I'm a Mary Seeger Boyle postdoctoral research fellow at Princeton University. And for the past year, together with Dimitris Papanikolaou and Maria Bolezzi, we have also been working to bring forth the network Rethinking Modern Greek Studies, as Dimitris has already said. So I'm very pleased to be chairing today's virtual discussion, the third in the series we have organized, and the title of today's discussion is on Islands and Camps, from Leros to Lesvos. Those who have been following the activities of this network from the very beginning will remember that it is not the first time our critical attention turns to the space of the island. Back in January, in our very first meeting, Evelyn Minor convincingly and powerfully argued for the Aegean islands as archipelagos where utopian futures could be imagined. Today, we will turn to the other side of the story. One could call it a rather dystopian past continuous of displacement, exile, and imprisonment. And by doing that, we also ask the question, can the Greek islands be viewed as biopolitical spaces of confinement? And what can their past tell us about their present? We are joined today by the panel of excellent speakers, Neni Panouria, Danai Karidaki, and Pausanias Karasanassis. And all the three speakers' work probes different aspects of the histories of confinement, at the same time as it also charts those histories for the present. And we're really excited to have all three of them join us today in this virtual seminar. But before we turn to our speakers, let me just say a quick housekeeping note. So each of them will speak for approximately 15 minutes, after which a discussion will follow. Those who are watching us on Zoom can submit their questions via the Q&A or the chat function, while those who are watching us on YouTube can type their questions into the live stream chat. And if you have a question, I encourage you to post it early on rather than wait until the very end of the presentations, because this way we will hopefully be able to address as many questions as possible. So on this note, and without further ado, let me turn to our first speaker, Nani Panuria, who is an anthropologist, academic advisor for the Justice in Education Initiative, and the faculty at the Prison Education Program at Columbia University. She's the co-editor-in-chief of Anthropology and Humanism, the flagship journal of the Anthropology and Humanism section of the American Anthropological Association. Her work has received numerous prizes and awards, and her publications are indeed field-shaping. Among them, there are books Fragments of Death, Fables of Identity, An Athenian Anthropography, as well as Dangerous Citizens, The Greek Left, and The Terror of the State. Nani Panuria's most recent publication is called Leros, the Grammar of Confinement, and here it is in my hands. It is published this year by the Greek publisher Nefeli, but is also forthcoming in English as well. And it is indeed a great book, or if I dare to say, a multimedia project in the print form, with musics, photographs, archival material, lists, and notes that are weaved in the very fabric of this book as well. Today, Nana will share some of the insights from this work in her presentation entitled Infrastructural Governmentalities or Confinement by Any Other Name, the Paradigm of Leros. Thank you, Nana, for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Christina. Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you to Dimitris and Maria Dimitris Papanikolaou and Maria Velletzi for all three of you for putting this together. Thank you to Torch for hosting. I think that there will be a chronology on Leros up pretty soon, so I will not go over it in the text. And here it goes. So 1, the focus on non-monumental infrastructures and the way in which the discontinuities observed in their use ultimately produces governmental continuity allow me to investigate the relationship between infrastructure and governmentality from a completely novel perspective. Nations claim uninterrupted and contiguous connections with an often mythical past, usually invoking biomedical metaphors of blood. Rather than being inspired by such paradigmatic metaphors of continuity, I focus on a different biomedical metaphor, a metaphor of discontinuities as the key to understanding the imaginary of the nation, its state power, and the modalities of its implementation. I look at analogies of such processes of continuity through the materiality of discontinuity by looking at the human nervous system, and especially at the nodes of Ranvier. The nodes of Ranvier are interruptions of the protective myelin on the length of the neurons that intensify the action potential, constituting thus a discontinuity that rather than impeding communication and connectivity, it accelerates them, thereby enabling the rapid travel of the action. We can talk about the nodes of Aegean later. They're very small and nodes on the nervous peripheral system, and I can explain more what they are. This is the model that I use to analyze a case in which the discontinuous actions of the state constitute and intensify its own infrastructures of governmentality on the micro level of the individual citizen. I'm looking at the intractability of categories, the impossibility of an ethical extraction of politics from geography, of economics from psychographies. I'm looking at the impossibility of maintaining distinct and pristine classifications that collapse on themselves under the weight of their own actions. I'm looking at the existence of such multiple and multiply layered classifications and categorizations on the track of history of a single place, the island of Leros, on the eastern edges of the Aegean Sea. And I'm looking at a particular node, I call it Foucault's node, of forced movements bearing the indelible and still extant tint of barracks, schools, political prisons, exile camps, psychiatric hospitals, refugees, migrants. I'm looking at the governmentalities of infrastructures. If we could have the photographs, Christina, that would be great. The image of continuity and discontinuity captured nationalist imaginations and their critics since the first articulations of the concept in the late 18th century. Continuity and discontinuity are invoked as processes of identity formation of the nation, but not necessarily as mechanisms of the numinous infrastructure of the state. Although the importance of large infrastructural projects as statements of the state is visible in its symbolic imposition, be that the case of the interwar fascist and Nazi states of Italia Imperiale, the Third Reich, and the Third Greek Republic, or colonial formulations such as the British Empire or the French Republic, the small, unassuming, and insignificant buildings that might be called the bureaucracy of material infrastructure carry the labor and weight of the state's infrastructural apparatus without claiming an overt continuity of meaning and signification. I'm indexing buildings that have stood for a century as places of confinement and exclusion, even if the specifics of the confinement are not diachronically the same or contiguous. Buildings on Leros, the island of abjection, the place that in 1972 was called by Eugenia McGrath the death island that no one ever visits. Leros went from the Byzantine Empire to the Ottoman Empire in the 16th century and on to the Italian Empire in 1912 until it was united with Greece in 1948. The infrastructural construction on Leros began when the Dodecanese Islands were passed from the Ottoman Empire to Italy in 1912 and secured in 1923 through the Treaty of Lausanne. Leros was then appointed as the main naval base of the new Italia Imperiale, and construction of the base and the buildings that I'm looking at was completed in 1927. The project intensified after Cesare Maria De Vecchi was appointed governor of the Dodecanese and started the rebuilding of the island according to the principles of razionalismo italiano and architettura razionale. After the Battle of Leros in 1943, the barracks of the naval base were used by the German army to contain Italian prisoners of war. In 1944, the British army used the barracks to house German prisoners of war. In 1948, Leros was ceded to Greece, and in 1949, the Greek state used the base as a campus for the newly established trade schools, where in a project of re-education and rehabilitation, it housed and schooled captured underage leftist guerrillas and orphans of the Greek Civil War. From 1950 until 1964, the schools became the place for socialization of indigent adolescents from the Greek provinces, while starting in 1957, in some of the buildings, the state established a psychiatric hospital. In 1967, while retaining the psychiatric hospital, the Greek junta used the remaining buildings as a camp for political prisoners that closed under international pressure in 1970. The psychiatric hospital remained operative and achieved such levels of dysfunction and abuse that it became synonymous with the scandal of psychiatric malpractice until a deinstitutionalization program effectively closed down the dorm buildings. I pay much more attention to the hospital in the book, but here I know that the Nike Arivaki will refer to it more specifically. In 2016, under the agreement of Fortress Europe, a refugee hotspot was planted on the grounds of the old barracks. We can see the infrastructural legacy of the Italian Empire as the equivalent of a bureaucracy, as part of what constitutes the insolvent glue that keeps the power of the state intact. Part of this power of the state is located precisely in the modalities by which such power is being understood and experienced on the local level by people who are being called to carry out its quotidian affairs. Even though the content of such infrastructure might not be the same, thus naval officers and submarine sailors are different than guerrilla orphans, psychiatric patients, political prisoners, or stateless and homeless refugees. The local population employed in such places understands itself as part of the civil service. Therefore, the differences that appear in the utilization of such spaces intensify the presence of the state, make the experience understood faster and more intently than if the utilization was the same and the execution of power uninterrupted in a manner very similar to the nodes of Rambier. The state, in these cases, becomes the arbitrary arbiter of the existence of the person, tying subjects in an intractable node that disallows for the process of self-ascription. Hence, the subjects of the state, whether they are conscripts of an empire who live in the barracks, the orphans of a political adversary, the psychiatric hospital, or the political prisoner, become objects whose existence is not only dependent upon, but also tightly regulated by the power of the state. The local population on Leros specifically recognizes that the stringing together of these state interventions creates infrastructures of governmentality. These material bureaucracies who not only exercise their power onto the subjects housed in the buildings, but have also created a compliant local force of civil servants, largely but not entirely compliant. 3. Thinking on that traumatic moment that was to put an end on all traumatic moments, the war that would end all wars, the First World War, Walter Benjamin concentrated on a minute conceptual detail that has since exploded all minute details. I quote, "A generation that had gone to school on a horse-drawn streetcar now stood under the open sky in a countryside in which nothing remained unchanged but the clouds. And beneath these clouds, in a field of force of destructive torrents and explosions, was the tiny, fragile human body." It's come from the storyteller. Benjamin was, of course, thinking about the combined circumstances of war and the technological advancements that had produced a different landscape for its comprehensibility when he talked about the only two unchanged constants, the clouds and the fragility of the human body. This comprehension translates with difficulty. It can be intellectually or ethically accessed, but it fails to mobilize the emotional force necessary to mobilize a popular movement. It moves across affective spaces haltingly, as experience that resists its own translation. I think about another moment, on the wake of another war, and of another fragile human body and its psychogeography. Joanne was a Greek-American woman whose mother, at the age of 17 in 1942, in the middle of the Second World War, and at the height of the Great Famine that hit Greece, had been brought to the United States to a farm outside of Lincoln, Nebraska, as a bride to an already established Greek farmer aged 50 at the time. The mother repeated the story often. She would go out in the farm at night when there was a moon, because the moon was the only sight that was familiar to her, the only recognizable part of the environment, the only thing that she knew that Greece and Lincoln, Nebraska, had in common. How do we write about this? How do we write precisely on the fissure of such existence, of being as human? What sorts of intellectual capacities are demanded in order not to simply describe and analyze a fissure, but more importantly, to saturate back together? Leros is an island in the Aegean Sea, part of the Dardanelles, off the coast of Turkey. Leros is Foucault's node, returns us to a different ethics that moves away from the morality of numbers. Leros as exile, as the island of human refuse. Leros has always borne the mark of extreme poverty, a blot in the circle of roads, gorse, kindness. Poverty that has a particular stain carried over to its inhabitants. Leros has consistently had a population of around 7,000 people. The node of Leros, more so than any other place in Greece or even globally, becomes even tighter, intractable by the fact that any of the institutional allo-ascriptions of being are resolutely non-essential, whether as in the military, in the insane asylum, the prison, the rehabilitation training camp, the refugee asylum hotspot, raises the legal persona in the psychic person, where there is no possibility for a state of being that is anything other than exilic. Which brings me back to Benjamin, the starry night, and the moon outside of Lincoln, Nebraska. Foucault has noted that the violence of institutions is not located in a proformed brutality, but rather in the dispersals of their technologies and methodologies, in the recognition of the genealogy that strings them together across a broad social domain. Foucault produces this epistemological string theory through a curious methodology. He refuses to succumb to enumerative projects of historians and ethicists and resists any genealogical linearity, which means K does not come between J and L, looking instead at what Anne Stoller has called unfinished abutments and anticipatory strings of dots, in an analytical frame that engages of a contemporaneity of the non-contemporaneous, a past that should not be, and a present that shouldn't be, a present in the past, already in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nene, for this really rich presentation with setting out, astonishing history of Leros, you could say, and doing it so masterfully in, this short period of time. Thank you very much. Many of things to discuss, but for now, let me turn to our second speaker, who will focus on a specific moment of this rich history of Leros. And our second speaker is Danaika Ridaki, who is a historian and is currently conducting her postdoctoral research project on the post-war history of the Leros institutions at the University of Thessaly. She received her PhD from Birkbeck, University of London in 2016 and has held teaching positions both in Birkbeck and at the University of Athens as well. Her book, History and Psychoanalysis in the Columbus Center, The Meaning of Evil, is forthcoming from Routledge. But in the meantime, her edited volume, Leros in the Spotlight and on the Margin, History, Politics, Psychiatry, is out. And here it is for everyone to see as well. Published by the publishing house Psiphides in Greece just this year, and bringing together a wide community of scholars from perspectives so different as psychiatry, history, musicology, anthropology, together to probe into the history of Leros from different aspects. Today, then I will share the insights from her work on Leros in the presentation entitled Towards a Greek Neverland, the Infantilization of Leros Institutions, Inmates with Intellectual Disability in the period between 1958 and 1995. Thank you very much, Danai, for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Hello, Christina. Hello, everybody. Good evening. Let me start by thanking the organizers of this very interesting event, Christina, Maria, and Dimitris, for the invite. I'm really very happy and honored to be here, especially during these very hard times that we're all experiencing. It's really a relief to have these opportunities. I'll try to share my screen now. You are all able to see it. Okay, so the traumatic history of chronic and multi-layered confinement on Leros that Neni Panourias just now so vividly presented reveals what can indeed be called a biopolitical space, an intersection between welfare, surveillance, and discipline on behalf of the post-Civil War Greek state, and the multiple ways in which incarceration, punishment, and often re-education are intertwined with efforts of providing care, medical services, care and medical services, rendering, in either case, the inmates' bodies property and fieldwork of state policies. Within this broader discussion, and after the famous 1989 Observer front page about the awful living conditions on the Leros Psychiatric Hospital, Leros has been identified as Europe's and definitely Greece's guilty secret, causing feelings of embarrassment and guilt in the eyes of the foreign observers that triggered the long overdue as well as controversial reform of Greek psychiatry in the 90s. There is another secret, however, that has yet to be disclosed: the history of a much less discussed institution on Leros and of much more neglected inmates. It is the Leros Pikpa Asylum that opened its gates in 1961 in Laki. If you can see the map here, this is a map of Leros. You can see that Laki is here on the inland, unlike most of the other pavilion that were actually by the sea here in Lepida and Aiorgis. So it opened its gates in 1961 to accommodate people with intellectual disability. And let me make a brief note here to say that I'm using the term intellectual disability as it is the one that has been chosen by activists of people who fight for the rights of people with intellectual disability. Despite the fact that as a historian in the archives, I find interchangeable terms such as idiocy, imbecility, or mental retardation. The Leros Pigpa Asylum opened its gates 3 years after the mental hospital, which opened its gates in 1958. Although it was not an institution exclusively designed for people with intellectual disability, the archives reveal that all of its inmates shared this diagnosis. For example, of the 266 inmates accommodated in Leros Pigpa Asylum in 1964, 77 are diagnosed with encephalopathy, severe mental retardation. I'm quoting here from the archives. 54 with severe mental retardation idiocy, 18 with Mongolian idiocy, the so-called, the well-known Down syndrome, and 14 with microcephaly idiocy, while the rest suffer from other syndromes that always include intellectual disability. The archives also reveal that regardless of their diagnosis, they were treated with antipsychotics and sedative drugs, similar to the ones prescribed to the inmates of the mental hospital. Anyway, up until the 80s, there was just one doctor, Efthymios Baklesos, who was part of the staff of the mental hospital, and he would visit the Pigpa Asylum once a week, and he would have to treat actually more than 2,500 patients. In terms of class and social background, the majority of the Leros Pigpa Asylum inmates seem to be coming from the so-called, this is how actually the doctors claim, from the socially unclaimed of Athens. Of the 257 admissions between 1963 and 1969, 216 were insured under the Poverty Fund, Tamiya Aporias, and almost half of them came from Athens. You can see some photos that were taken that I took in 2018 here. This is photos of the Pigpa Asylum in Laki. The Leros Pigpa Asylum inmates were excluded from their families and society, and their living conditions on the island were horrific. They lived in a 1930s Italian military building with no lifts or ramps for those who also suffered from a physical disability. Toilets and showers were only introduced in the 80s, just a few years before the beginning of the reform, the deinstitutionalization, and were not covered by the anyway inadequate central heating of the building. The inmates ate or were fed, more often than not, in bed, while many of them were routinely confined to bed by force when staff couldn't enforce discipline otherwise. Now, the historical origins of the Leros Pigpa Asylum are very interesting and relevant to our discussion. Leros Pigpa Asylum was part of the Patriotic Institution for Social Welfare and Protection. This is what the Pigpa, what Pigpa stands for in Greek, actually, which is a large institutional network that functioned under the auspices of the palace. It was founded in 1914 as a ladies' charity, and its resources included members' contributions, donations, royal sponsorship, and state funding. During the interwar period, it emerged as the main institution of social policy and practice for maternity and childhood. At a time when child mortality was still very high in Greece, it used a large network of female volunteers to enlighten working class mothers on issues of hygiene and the so-called normal development of children. On this poster of the Patriotic Institution on your left-hand side, you can see some instructions provided to mothers on breastfeeding and actually states that the chance of mortality for babies who are not breastfed are much higher than those who actually are breastfeeding. So they sort of create these guidelines and normative model for mothers during this period. Although other aims are recorded, such as care for the poor and victims of natural disasters, the principal aim of the patriotic institution was to protect maternity and childhood. This is this is manifested, for example, in this poster that comes from the first Balkan exhibition for child protection that was held in Athens in April 1936. In 1953, Legislative Decree 2690 allowed the formation of PICPA services for the protection of maternity and childhood in the country. And a few years later, in March 1961, the PICPA Asylum of Leros was launched under the name Leros Center for Child Care. Now, the relevance of the historical origins of the asylum is relevant because of PICPA's historically manifested aim to promote child protection and maternity. And this aim actually resonates also with what we can find in the archives about the Leros PICPA Asylum's purpose. In particular, we read in the annual reports that in 1960s Greece, the annual reports that are found in the Leros PICPA Asylum archive, we read that in 1960s Greece, children with intellectual disability that stay at the family home, which was a practice that was quite common up until the early post-war period, that children with intellectual disability used to stay in the family, in the community, and it was sort of a modern phenomenon to start locking up these children in asylums. It is stated that children with intellectual disability that stay at home are actually a burden for the family, that they make their mothers, and especially working mothers, it is stressed that now many mothers start to, that they enter the job market. They make both their mothers and the other siblings' life difficult. So in a way, the welfare state here proposes the solution of the asylum within a context of care. This is supposedly a solution to provide care for these children, as well as together with a normative gendered model for mothers and children, both the children with intellectual disability and those their siblings. That actually shows that the stigma that we usually referring to of a family with a member with intellectual disability is a rather modern concept, that in the past, this is the exception to the rule is the asylum and not the other way around. That modern, those who actually seek and ask for a reform for these people to come back to the community is more of a coming back to the norm, as this is actually something that historian Simon Jarrett, a very well-known historian of intellectual disability, has very powerfully claimed in his book. Now, as part of child protection services, according to the decree for its establishment, the Leros PICPA Asylum's purpose was to care for children between 0 and 18 years old. And I quote here, suffering from incurable physical handicaps, severe non-trainable mental retardations, and in general, incurable and non-improvable severe disorders with or without neurological and physical damage. Yet, regardless of their actual age, the inmates stayed at PICPA long after they became adults. For example, the annual medical reports in the archives reveal that, and I quote here, girls who were admitted at least 2 years ago are so developed that they have secondary female characteristics, breasts, pubic hair, etc., and that physical development does not, in most cases, match intellectual development. This was something that was quite striking for those who actually, the care providers at PICPA. Anne Gath, who was registrar of Britain's Royal College of Psychiatrists between 1988 and 1993, who visits Leros and especially the PICPA asylum in May 1991, writes that at the time of her visit, only 31 of the PICPA asylum inmates were younger than 18 years old. Despite their actual age, reports Gath, the Leros PICPA asylum inmates are, and I quote, often referred to as children. British psychiatrist John Henderson, who was involved in monitoring the reform program in the 90s on behalf of the European Commission, observes, no one who visited the PICPA institution at the time would ever forget the appalling physical and social living conditions which over 160 so-called children and the staff had to endure. Most of these children had grown to adolescence or adulthood during their years of incarceration. Both Gath and Henderson underline the fact that in the discourse of care providers and policymakers, the PICPA inmates were referred to or called as children, although despite the fact that they were adults. For instance, members of the PICPA board, the Athens PICPA board, who came in Leros in 1989, report in one sentence that the majority of inmates are adults, and in the very next sentence, they themselves write, during our stay, we observed that many of the children help other children in their everyday needs. This discursive infantilization of the Leros PICPA asylum inmates actually persists to our day. During the interviews I conducted with members of either current or former members of the staff of PICPA, both Haris Evangelou, who used to be a technician at PICPA, and Maria, who was a nurse, told me that we call them pedakia, which in Greek means small children. And of course, this infantilization is not an exclusively Greek phenomenon. Historian of intellectual disability James Trent describes the image of, and I quote, feeble-minded people as children of pure nature in 18th century America. The infantilization of people with intellectual disability emerges perhaps from certain behaviors brought about in the institutional environment of the Leros PICPA asylum that the Greek child psychiatrist John Tsiandis, who later on participated in the deinstitutionalization project of PICPA in the 90s. So he describes as, and I quote, excessive dependence and inhibition. In his account of lay attitudes towards what he calls idiots in Victorian England, David Wright observes that, and I quote, the intellectual disability of the individual evoked strong allusions to the permanency of the childlike dependence, and records relative testimonies who illustrate the idiots with phrases such as childish in her ways or childlike in his innocence. People with intellectual disability were thus seen as dependent, helpless, and in constant need of a parent. Besides, it's no coincidence that according to the report that I presented before, PICPA that emerges as a charity for, and then a public institution for the protection of maternity and childhood, actually presents the aim of the PICPA asylum to free the mother of this excessive dependency of children with intellectual disability so that she can actually devote herself to her job or the other children at home, so that she doesn't, she's sort of, she will get rid of this burden, this excessive dependency. Except for this excessive dependency that reminds the dependency of a baby, there also emerges a matter of scale related to what Wright described as, and I quote, the relative backwardness of the child with intellectual disability vis-a-vis other children or adolescents of the same age. This backwardness is perceived as the inability of the person with intellectual disability to reach the so-called adult mind, and thus their fate to stay children forever. Michel Foucault, in his lectures on psychiatric power, also describes how idiocy or mental retardation can philosophically be seen as the early stage of child development. And I quote here, "The idiot is a certain degree of childhood, or again, if you like, childhood is a certain way of passing more or less quickly through the degrees of idiocy, debility, or mental retardation." Now, because of what Philippe Ariès called the modern concept of childhood, namely the perception of children as not merely being of a lower age, but as having different qualities than adults, the infantilization of people with intellectual disabilities makes their exclusion and abuse in the institutional context of Leros even more striking. In the modern era, a picture or report of a child victim of war, abuse, or neglect evokes more powerful feelings than the one of an adult in a similar situation. As Butler would argue in Precarious Lives, the bodies of children, or at least of Western children, are perceived as more valuable and worthy of mourning than those of the adults. In this light, because the Leros inmates with intellectual disabilities were institutionally and discursively treated as children, their abused and socially excluded bodies must have been experienced as worthier of compassion or mourning. The intellectual disability is somewhat humanized because it is attached to childhood, or, as Foucault put it, idiocy or mental retardation are temporal varieties of stages within the normative development of the child. The idiot belongs to childhood as previously he belonged to illness. It is now up to historians and other researchers of intellectual disability to further explore the history of this Greek Neverland, where some children never grew up. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Danaya. I'm unable to start my video for some reason, so I'm just speaking and hoping that the technical issue is going to be sorted out. Here we are. Thank you very much. We moved today from the larger histories of Leros and its multiple intersections that Nene presented us with, to the specific case of Danai working on the historical archives, trying to unravel what the grammar of this specific confinement entails. And I already see the multiple threads that could lead us to discussion. but I'm going to resist this urge for the moment in order to bring the island of Leros with another one of the islands that has been in the focus of attention in recent years, that of the island of Lesvos. And we are going to do that with the help of our next speaker, Pafthanias Karathanasis. Pafthanias is a visual anthropologist. He holds a PhD from the University of the Aegean, where between 2017-2018, he was also the coordinator of the Observatory of the Refugee and Migration Crisis in the Aegean. Pafthanias' main research interests include anthropology of space and place, visual culture, political anthropology and migration. While he's specifically interested in urban cultures, political and cultural grassroots initiatives in urban settings, and contested landscapes in cities and in borderscapes. He has done research on urban practices such as graffiti, street art, and political activism. And he has worked with grassroots initiatives in Athens, in Lesvos, and on the Green Line in Nicosia. Between 2016 and 2019, he was a researcher for the artistic festival Fast Forward at the Onassis Foundation. And since 2017, he is on the organizing committee of the Athens Ethnographic Film Festival. Since 2020, Pafthanias is a postdoctoral researcher at Pandya University, as well as at the University of the Aegean. The work that he's going to share with us today has been done in the framework of the Human City research program at the University of the Aegean under the supervision of Professor Efthymios Pavataxiarchis. And his presentation tonight is titled From the Hotspot to the Camp City, Moria Registration and Identification Center in Lesvos, and the end of the EU hotspot approach, focusing on the period before September 2020. Thank you, Pafthanias, for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Hello, everybody. Let me start by thanking everybody for today, Christina, Maria, and Dimitri. And I will share my screen. Yes. Okay. As Christina already mentioned, this work I will present today is it was done through one research program, the Human City Research Program that is ongoing, and through my experience as the coordinator of the Observatory of Refugee and Migration Crisis in the Aegean. Shops that sell groceries, drinks, cigarettes, bread, or even food like falafel and other ready-made food are quite common in several camps across Greece. And they have always been indications that these camps are becoming somehow permanent. Moria camp, however, has always been different. Being the largest hotspot in the Aegean and the most populated camp in Greece, Moria became notorious for the inhuman living conditions in the slum that grew around the main camp to accommodate a large number of people that was always over the official capacity. Over the years, the overpopulation of the camp the overpopulation of the Moria camp caused the reactions of the local society, in which xenophobic sentiments were on the rise. Since autumn 2019, there was a population explosion in Moria that resulted in the highest number of the camp during February 2020. 19,000 people in a camp with an official capacity of merely 3,000. The reasons for the population explosion were multiple, both short and long term. In the long term, the main reason for the overpopulation of Moria camp was the EU border policy, the so-called hotspot approach, the externalization of borders, and specifically the EU-Turkey deal, issued in 2016, according to which all asylum seekers should be geographically restricted to the islands until they have an answer to their asylum applications, a process that it could take up to 2 or even 3 years, depending on the ethnicity of the applicants. Only vulnerable cases were excluded from this restriction. In the short term, there was a significant rise in sea arrivals from summer 2019. Moreover, the rise in arrivals came together with a governmental change. The new conservative government wanted to follow a policy of closed camps and tried to enforce the construction of new facilities on the islands, but it was met with strong reactions by a wide part of the local society. The confrontation between the state and the local society, as well as several attacks towards both asylum seekers and humanitarian actors by far right-wing locals, pushed the residents of Moria within the camp and led several volunteers to leave the island. Further restriction of asylum seekers within the Moria camp was imposed during the national COVID-19 lockdown in March 2020, which continued throughout the summer, even if there was not a significant number of coronavirus cases or ways to apply physical distancing within the overcrowded camp. All the above was a brief layout of the context around Moria camp in the island of Lesvos when I did my last research visit in June 2020. Having personal experience on the island since the beginning of the so-called refugee crisis in 2015-2016, the situation in which I found the camp during this visit was surprising. The camp had grown significantly in size. As you can see in these Google Earth pictures, the difference between 2016, July 2018, and August 2020 is striking. In this GIF, we also can see the change in the area since 2006, when Moria was just the military barracks around which the hotspot was developed. People in Lesbos, locals, as well as NGO workers and volunteers, but also human rights activists, have been calling Moria camp a small city for years. For the population of the island, that is roughly 85,000, to have a settlement of more than 5,000 inhabitants was already a new small town. Despite the calls for the decongestion of the camp from both the local society and numerous humanitarian organizations, the population in Moria finally reached almost 20,000 and then it was definitely the second largest city of the island, after only the nearby capital Mytilene, with 30,000 people. Moria, however, was never understood as a city, and this was because it was always considered a temporary solution, a reception and identification center, a hotspot where people would only stay for a short period until they were processed by the Greek and European authorities. Authors in refugee studies have been discussing the idea of urbanization in several cases of large camps in Africa and the Middle East, where the prolonged temporariness has led the camp to develop and to be established into some sort of a city. But what kind of cities are those? What are their characteristics? And in which ways are different from other cities? Michel Agier has proposed the term naked city to describe an urbanization process that is unfinished. Bram Jansen, however, argues that these protracted camps are not cases of unfinished urbanization, but accidental cities that were developed through specific forms of urbanization under a powerful and successful humanitarian logic and management, thus proposing to see those cases as forms of humanitarian urbanism. The city camps, a term introduced by Agier, are peculiar and hybrid cases of urbanized camps. At this point, I would like to stress the fact that using these concepts that were developed by the study of the African and Middle Eastern refugee camps, I don't want to say that they can be compared to the case of Moria, but only to argue that they can be proven useful concepts in distinguishing Moria from most of the other camps in Greece or even other European territories. So in which ways was Moria different from the other European hotspots and camps? I argue that what I observed in my visit during this summer, it was in many ways a new and more established Moria. Although the camp had doubled its size and 6 more zones were added, the level of organization and the services provided to the inhabitants and the infrastructures added in the extensions around the main camp had certainly improved. However, at least 3 of these 12 zones in total, those labeled as self-settled, were without any infrastructures or services, thus forming an area that was called the jungle by its inhabitants, an unsafe, dark, and overcrowded slum. These are some pictures of the visit. What was very different, though, it was not the level of infrastructure and services provided by the international organizations and the NGOs, but the organization from below. The numerous grocery shops, falafel and other ready food shops, barber shops, bakeries, and even self-organized schools that they were spread all over the different zones of the wider camp. Together with the shops, there were supply networks, community spaces, and unofficial praying sites, religious sites, that they were operating by shady and often criminal networks, not only I don't mean the religious sites, but there were several accounts of shady networks. These were the indications that the Reception and Identification Center, the hotspot of Moria, had been transforming to a camp city. All these practices that were established by the needs of the people to improve their living space as they live there, creating social places with meaning and change it through their dwelling. What I observed during my visit was an established camp city, despite the reactions of the local society and the administrational obstacles they have been putting in the way of the further development of the camp. Moreover, the government's plan for closed camps for the asylum seekers on the Aegean Islands would be very difficult to be implemented in an already established camp city, since it would need infrastructures to be built from the scratch. This is why they attempted to build new camps in different and more isolated areas of the islands, but they were stopped by the widespread reactions of the islanders. Since September, however, Moria camp does not exist anymore. It was burned to the ground and completely destroyed by arson. This incident comes after a series of humanitarian arsons during the past years, which destroyed two other smaller facilities for newcomers and asylum seekers, one in northern Lesvos that was managed by UNHCR, and one close to Mytilene that was managed by an NGO. The destruction of Moria camp was shocking because it was the reason why thousands of people had to flee, once again, their houses and tents, leaving them days in the streets. Moreover, it signaled a new era in European policy on asylum and border management, since Moria could be seen as the archetype of the hotspot. Does the destruction of the notorious camp puts an end to the hotspot approach? And what is next? If we take a look to the new camp, which the authorities built from scratch, we see that it's equipped with a double fence, a police station within the camp, placed on a hill as a panopticon, and with the ability to close its gates whenever needed. Is this just a temporary solution of the new image of the management of the undesirables, to use Azier's words? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pausanias. Thank you very much as well for this insightful presentation that really ties in well with the previous two talks in terms of the fact that it really makes us think about, location and wonder, like, is there something in the location of the Greek island of Leros and Lesvos that really make them, places of confinement and participants in shaping these grammars. However, what I wanted to start this conversation from today, while we are waiting for other questions to tick in. So may I remind everyone that you can submit your question via chat or via the Q&A function or live stream chat on YouTube. So eagerly awaiting everybody's questions, and some of them are already coming in. But the question that I wanted to ask all three of the speakers relate to one specific moment. I think in the book of Nene Panouria, one of the most moving moments I found that occasion where in the 60s there is a moment of recognition between two people one of them is the inmate in the psychiatric clinic, and another one a prisoner. And at some point in that book, they recognize each other and say, "Oh, you're also from Acronissos." So there is a moment where, in a way, we have been seeing the chain of history and confinement, but there are also some certain moments in that history where two seemingly different histories intersect through the moment of encounter between different historical agents. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the meeting points between different histories that your research led to.
Are you asking me, Christina?
Anyone, but anyone also is free to start. Yeah, but yeah, since this is a moment that specifically refers to your book, you can also start.
I think that it's what I'm arguing is that these are not really different histories, right? These are histories which are very much part of the same body of history that we have, that not only indexes but also transcends, and as it constitutes the relationship between the state and the citizen. And it's very much, and I'm saying this unapologetically, it is very much a Foucauldian position, right? The fact that despite seeming discontinuities, in all essence, what we have is a continuation of state power or biopower by different means. So the contact between that you refer to between the prisoner, the exile of in 1968, and the psychiatric patient at the same time, who could speak through barbed wire. I mean, it's something that actually gets passed on to me as a narrative in 2003, right? So it is something that has kept its integrity as an experience, right? As a historical moment that then becomes narrated and re-narrated, causing the same both emotional but also political disturbance in the person, in the narrator. Right? But I'm sure that the nine of Pausanias would have more things to say.
The nine of Pausanias, would you like to jump in and also?
No. Thank you very much, Christina. I wanted to link your question also with something that comes from the audience, from actually Lori Kinehart, who is one of the contributors also of the book, with her anthropological actually tour on Leros, is one of the contributions to the edited volume that was published from Psiphides last July. And I wanted to stress, picking up the threads from Neni, that actually, who spoke about this Foucauldian sense of biopower by other means, this continuation, this history of confinement and this trauma, actually. I wanted to stress that to my eyes, there is this, it is discipline and punishment and surveillance and re-education with all these histories, both the schools So after the war, the schools, the technical school and the school for housekeeping for girls, the hospital and the PICPA, the camps for the political prisoners, and now even the refugees, that there is this sense in the state's discourse in which discipline and punishment is actually intertwined, linked with care. So it's very much with this sense of the welfare state providing care for the individuals, for the subjects, and it's presented this policy of actually putting to exile, incarcerating, punishing, is presented, and to some extent, it also is a sort of an application of care and welfare. And I think this is something that is a characteristic of the post-Civil War Greek state, that on Leros we see is a characteristic example, that is a very obvious example because of all these different uses of the same buildings of the Italian bit. There was an already made infrastructure, and this is why it was used. And we can see the state policy in which discipline and care come hand in hand. And actually, this is why I try to explore, and this is still work in progress. How does this use of the children metaphor, how does for these inmates, how does this come to the picture? Does it make the bodies of these people more worthier of mourning, of compassion, having this sort of parenting? Or is it just the discipline aspect of parenting that comes along? And it's something that is still an open question. I tried to also answer Laurie's question about the punitive approach to these bodies, despite the fact that they were presented as children. And I think this is an open question, but this is what I'm trying actually to spot and to further explore. How care with discipline come hand by hand. And this is actually, I started to research this a couple of years ago, and in the wake of the pandemic, this is actually very, very timely, how care and discipline, how this actually, I try not to see my research everywhere, but sometimes it's inevitable. Thank you.
Pausanias, if you...
Well, the obvious intersection between histories in modern day refugee influx, let's say, in Greece, is the comparison, especially in the northern and the eastern Aegean, with the refugees of the Asia Minor. We saw that a lot in the summer of 2015 with all the massive influx and all the, let's say, help and solidarity that people got from the locals. However, as the years passed, we saw all this care and solidarity to disappear, to give its place to a more hostile environment in the islands, and especially Lesbos. The reason for that, I mean, there can be a lot of reasons. However, one main reason is that after the EU-Turkey statement and the geographical restriction in the islands, and the people staying there, they weren't just passers-by anymore. They were there to stay, and this didn't really had a good reaction by the locals. As long as they were passing by, going somewhere else, it was fine. But from the moment that they stayed, and they stayed without, of course, their own will, and I think it's a parallel. I think it's a parallel process with the urbanization of Moria. It's a parallel process. The more Moria was being established, the more reactions it caused. I don't know. I don't believe. I don't believe any of the islanders wanted a new city in their islands.
Can I ask a brief question to all of you? Sorry, could I, Christina, just jump? It's just as a follow-up to what you were saying, Pafsania. How is the fact that all this happens in an island changing our perception of what you have been saying? The same goes to Danai, the same goes to Neni. The islandness of the island, is it only the fact that phantasmatically or in a national imaginary you can think of this space as enclosed and think of the population as one, or are there other aspects going on there? How everything that you have told us would have been slightly different if this were not islands? Sorry for jumping like that. I'm sorry, Christina.
I think that in the case of Leros, this could not have happened on a mainland area, and for a number of reasons. First of all, it was the ability of the Italian Empire to think in such geographical and geographical terms, geomilitary terms actually, that when they came into contact with Leros, they realized the fact that they could have the safest harbor they could there. So the reasoning was purely instrumental, because as anyone who's been to Leros knows, if you're standing at the harbor, you cannot see even the huge big boats that come docking, and now you cannot see them until the boat is right in front of you. Right? It's something that does not happen in any other island. So the island is, of course, Spiros Adrachas' very theory here is very interesting, although I think flawed, in the sense that the islands, especially the islands in the Aegean, all islands, they're being thought of as an archipelago, right? They are all interconnected, and they constitute a sort of a singular islandic presence. However, we know that even with the with the existence of guards towers, right, frictorias that have been on the islands since Neolithic times, we know that even with this very primitive way of keeping in contact with each other, so starting from that, all the way to more recent ways of communication, we know that the islands become really isolated for about half of the year. So the fact that you have an island which can provide you with safe harbor, but on the same at the same moment, the island is a unique and separate entity, of course, intensifies the its usage as a space of I will not say confinement at this moment right now, but as a space of difference, right? I'm just putting it as innocuously as possible, right? The island of Leros, and I want to address a question that came in, or no, Eli's question. Leros is confinement itself. The entire island is a space of confinement. The people who were in the barracks and at the schools and in the psychiatric hospital and at the exile camps and the hotspot are confined. They do exist in spaces in the same space of confinement, but the local population also lives in a state of confinement. So I think that this would not be possible on the mainland. I mean, we have examples from people who have been exiled on spaces on exiles mainland, and we know that the difference in the relationship with the local population and with the modalities of surveillance by the state are very different. Is that what you were asking, Dimitri?
Yes, of course. Yes, and I'm sure that the others will have time to sort of enter this discussion. Perhaps with the next questions, I don't know. Perhaps we should include. But yes, exactly. What does it change? And of course, for all of us in Greek studies, it's very interesting, I suppose, in many other places in the world too, because the island archipelago has been so central in this kind of national imaginary. And you all three present a different picture, of course, which has always been with us too. As a type of national imaginary, only it's the other side of the national imaginary. The islands of confinement, and yes, this is what I essentially was asking. Yeah,
Dimitri, I think I mean my answer would be kind of similar, because it's exactly because these hotspots were on the islands that they were hotspots. I mean, and it's closely connected with what we call the externalization of European borders. They're not exactly outside European borders, but it doesn't really matter. They are confined there. And the main the main focus of European authorities were not to lose all these people within Europe, not to leave them go to reach the mainland, because from there they could be lost. But keeping them in the islands is confinement. I mean, I totally agree with Nani. We can see that even in Australia. They're building camps in the surrounding islands. They don't want them in the mainland.
Yeah, may I add something to that? I agree with both Neni and Pausanias on actually that the islands present sort of a natural prison because of the borders, and especially I think it applies both to Leros and to Lesvos. Their distance from the metropolitan center, Athens, I think it also plays a significant role. However, I also want to stress the fact that, at least in the history of psychiatry, in the late 80s, so with the Observer, the article, this front page that caused the scandal, of course, all these were well known before 1989 in Greece, with the group of Leros who tried to actually advocate for a change, with the front page on Tachydromos in 1982, Eleftherotypia in 1983. So it was a common secret, but it became a scandal in the eyes of the foreigners. It's a sort of classic Greek attitude that it became, and this is how it started. It triggered the reform of Greek psychiatry across Greece, and Leros became the flagship of Greek of the reform of Greek psychiatry. However, the situation, the condition, for example, in other mental hospitals, such as Daphne in Athens, was way worse. And this is something, for example, that Felix Gattari mentions this in his diary in 1989, which is just over is in Attica. Okay, it's not on an island far away. So I think the fact that the insularity, the fact that it's the island, maybe also because it also in the eyes of the foreigners, Greece. So Greece is the islands and the holiday and etc. etc. So it might be also there is this sense of going back and forth through this colonial gaze. And I also want to stress, I mean, as a historian, to stress the fact that it's because of the infrastructure, because of the Mussolini picks the island in the 20s because of, as Neni mentioned, because of the port. This natural port is the second biggest port in the whole Mediterranean after Malta, and the biggest in Eastern Mediterranean. So this is why they pick it. The local population doesn't accommodate Laki at that point. They all live in Agia Marina on the north, let's say, of the island, and because the King Paul and Federica find this infrastructure after the war and after the Civil War, they decide to use these buildings to make the schools, and then it's used by the Ministry of Health for the mental hospital, and then so it's a practical reason. Yet this is something that I agree with Neni, that Leros is confinement, but it's very interesting that the locals are very reluctant in speaking about this traumatic history. So, for example, when I went there and I stayed there, and they would see me going to a taverna and by my own reading a book, they would ask me, "What are you a teacher?" I said, "No, I'm researching the history of Leros." And they asked, "Oh, you're researching the Battle of Leros. We have a very interesting history here, the Nazis, etc., etc." But they were as soon as I told them in the beginning that I'm really looking for the hospital, they felt there was this guilt and sense of that taking part. So it's really, and it's very important for us as researchers not to reproduce the stigma that comes with the locals, that they were part of that they were the similar to the SS guards of Auschwitz, because they weren't. Because there might be some cases where we do have punitive, even sadistic behaviors that are reported, but we need to always bear in mind that it was the state who actually used people with no training whatsoever. So they were unskilled workers, they were fishermen and whatever, just the state used them as workers. And there was this, of course, we also need to always bear in mind this economic relationship between the state and the locals, which is very important part of their if I may say so, identity. So I think it's multifaceted, not easy to answer whether it's the island, whether it's a specific case, whether there's something extraordinary about Leros. It's still open. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I follow up on
Sure. Yeah, actually, there is a question I was just going to say that asks exactly that.
Yeah, I was going to answer that. I was going to.
Yeah, so there is a question just if for those people who haven't seen it on watching us on YouTube, the question is to speak a little bit more about exactly this relationship between island locals as local agents of the state bureaucracy and those incarcerated. And if I then may and add up to that question, another one that we had on YouTube that asks also specifically Nanny to talk a little bit, saying that at some point you mentioned that the goal of your broader project is repair rather than just describe. And so what does this repair actually entail? How would you like to use to see this knowledge you're creating used in the future? So,
I'm
sorry, two questions.
Okay, that's all right. That's all right. I'm just trying to think about where I actually talked about repair. It might come to me, but I agree. I agree, of course, with what Anai just described. I think that we need to keep in mind the fact that the hospital, the psychiatric hospital, or rather, let me just backtrack. All the interventions by the Greek state onto Leros have been the result of the decolonization of the island. So when Leros, along with the rest of the Dodecanese, when the Italian front fell, and then within 3 years they were passed from Italian suzerainty to the Nazis, then to the British, and then finally there was the incorporation into Greece. The island, Leros much more so for various reasons, much more so than most of the rest of the Dodecanese, was found without any at all sources of income, and because of the really brutal bombings that had happened during the Battle of Leros in 1943, the soil had become so toxic that agriculture could not go on. So they needed, and also they had been working. The local population had been working on the Italian bases from 1927 through 1943, right? So there was a very complex economy there that got completely dislocated and disrupted with the incorporation. So local politicians actually intervened with the central state in Athens, asking that Leros be counted among the places that needed to be reorganized financially through Athens. So that's part of the reason why the schools were brought there. This is precisely why the psychiatric hospital was brought there. Actually, it came out through the office of Ioannis Zigdis, the MP for the Dodecanese, through very specific request to the Ministry of Finances in Athens in 1957. The local population had been, that's part of what I'm arguing, the local population had been brought into the state economic machinery, that it was impossible to to liberate it from it. Let me put it that way. So, so the relationship between the local population and state power from that came straight from Athens was such that was very tense, right? I mean, it included an incredible tension in it. But the other thing that I wanted to mention that ties on to this is the fact that precisely because the local population had been turned into civil service force, and between 1957 and 1967, or rather 1963, when the schools closed, in 1967, the only source of income that they could have was the hospital, the psychiatric hospital, and Big Bang. And because during the junta, the local population was not utilized in the surveillance or care or anything of the such as it was of the exiles, the local population was forced to be working at the hospital. That has created a deep trauma in the local population. So I think that the reluctance that you mentioned, Danai, is on a certain level is guilt, but on another level, the level of trauma which has not been addressed yet is insurmountable. When we presented the book on Leros in September, and I was showing that I had asked someone there to show the photographs the way that Christina did right now, and they were on a loop. He asked me if I wanted to show, he was going through each folder, and he was asking this one, that, and when he got to the hospital, I said, probably we shouldn't show this. And he turned to me and said, my father took me there when I was 5 because he couldn't leave me home. He needed to take me with me to work. And I would really rather not show these photographs because they really are brutal. Right. So and this is, this is second generation, right? Yeah, that's what I wanted to say.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nene. We also had question or 2 questions from Maria. And so since we have her with us, yeah, Maria, if you could ask your question.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I actually have a question mostly directed to Danai, but it could also be something for Neni. And then I also have another question for Pausanias, but I'll try to be very brief. Danai, you referred to this process of discursive infantilization of inmates with disabilities and the connotation this brings with it, helplessness, dependency, and how this vulnerability actually turned into an excuse or a justification for their confinement and also for extracting them from the mother, from parents, and from society altogether. So I was wondering, how can anyone tell or retell that history of abuse without, however, resorting to the trope of victimhood, which would also be depriving these inmates from the possibility to somehow become subjects of history, able to somehow speak back even beyond their deaths. So what alternative, we were talking about grammars of confinement, and I was thinking, how can we formulate, what are the alternative grammars that we might have as scholars to counter this grammar of infantilization and its extension or flip side, perhaps the grammar of victimhood. And then to Pausanias, Pausania, you left us with this striking aerial photo of the new camp on Lesvos that replaced Moria. Moria, and of the question, the open question, is this the end of the hotspot or not, or the beginning of something different or not? And I think we can all kind of speculate as to the answer to this question. But I do want to actually ask you to give your own more elaborate answer to that question, and that you posed at the end, and comment perhaps, if you want, on the or compare the different images of the infrastructure from above of the new camp and Moria. Thanks.
May I start with thank you, Maria, for this very interesting question. It actually also makes me think further on what I'm trying to explore. I think, yes, it's it's I wouldn't want to say tempting, but sometimes we also, as researchers, might fall into this trap of presenting history in these terms of perpetrators and victims, especially in cases where there is such the trauma is actually so multi-layered on so many levels and on so many aspects of the subjects' lives. I think that infantilization, although it might be patronizing, there is a certain degree of patronizing to actually refer to this to the subjects, people with intellectual disability on Leros, as children. This is what actually I'm trying to explore, that there is, precisely because of how valuable children are in the Western world, in the modern Western world, I think there is a degree of humanization of those individuals beyond their identity as victims, but also as there is high chance of treating these people as not as humans, precisely because, unlike many of the inmates of the mental hospital, who actually many of them suffered from, there are many reasons for their incarceration, their confinement in the hospital, but many of them were quite they perfectly, hadn't it been Leros, they could have just perfectly fit in society and be perfectly capable of engaging in a conversation. And even people whom I met now, because now the Leros hospital is still open, as perhaps not everybody knows that, and there are almost by now 200 patients of those who actually, because it no longer functions as an asylum. It means that there are patients are admitted for a brief period of time, they take their medication, and then at some point they go back to the outer world. Some of these older patients with whom I engaged in conversation, despite the impact of institutionalization, they're perfectly, I mean, you can just engage in conversation, and actually they can even share some of their feelings and anxieties and stories. With the PICPA inmates, precisely because they were the most severe cases, there was high chance of actually just treating them as animals, just to be very open with you. And I think that these children, these pedakia, was this, how to put it, despite being patronizing, etc., despite being problematic as a categorization, it leaves open very small space for humanizing them, for feeling compassion, along with making their bodies open to discipline, and to their bodies were public there to to do what the state could do anything they wanted on their bodies. At the same time, at least for the staff, there was this array of compassion, and I don't know if because it's something that I'm still working on, and I don't really know how to. I don't know if I helped.
Yeah, no, I definitely get your point and the ambivalence there. I was just thinking, like, from the point of view from you as a scholar, how can you talk about their stories without falling into the trope of victimhood, which also follows the humanitarian discourses about refugees and migrants at the moment as well. So that kind of links up also with representation of the migration crisis, or whatever you call it. But yeah, thank you for thinking with me.
Maria, yes. I think my answer will be, I will try to tie my answer to a previous question as well, that I wanted to say something. Okay, we all agree that islands were and still are places and spaces of confinement. However, what we have seen the past year is different levels of confinement within the islands. In the case of Lesbos, the attempt of the new government to make closed camps in an already confined area, it means that it wants to kind of protect the local population as if it was the national population. You see what I'm trying to do? Like, it's not enough to be confined in the island, because even there they are seen. So we want to confine them within an already confined space. So if we see, and I want to show you something, so I'm gonna share my screen. If we see these two pictures, we see the Moria camp and the new camp. You see that the new camp is on a peninsula, is a much more confined space than the other one, which was in the middle of the island, let's say. It's they are moved to the edge. I like this metaphor that this is an island on the island idea. So, and I think that's enough. So what I want to say is that in the beginning of the crisis, the so-called refugee crisis, the hotspot was an idea that it could, an idea of a space that will, a lot of different organizations will come in, like the European Asylum Support Office, international and interstate organizations, UNHCR, the Greek Army, Greek Asylum Service. They were all coming together in order to make the process more easy and then let them through. However, what we see now, even if we don't know if this new camp will stay there, it's still under discussion, is that we move from the idea of the hotspot as a gate through to an idea of more confinement, to an idea of, and this I think resonates with the new asylum policy and the new border control policy of Europe. It's a move to more confinement. In many levels, let's say, geographically, politically, yeah.
Thank you, Professor.
But that's the move globally. The move globally is for more confinement, right?
Yeah.
To be honest, living in what we're living now, the mood globally is also for more island as well. You know, this kind of idea that even your house should be an island now. And I know we're getting to the close, and I will leave it to Christina and Maria to do the close. But I wanted just to mention, so that it is mentioned within this time, and from my side, to thank you all for coming. But I wanted to mention that this new interest in thinking about the islands, of course, we have Pausanias's work that has been published electronically and in other means, but we also have these two books on Leros that came in the last 2-3 months came out in Greece by Greek publishing houses that are headed by young intellectuals, both of them. They are two books that stood side by side on the bookstores. I mean, I don't have them with me now. Christina has them. For me, it was almost like a sign to have this discussion, a discussion like the one we had today. And I want to underline that they both came from publishers who have also a kind of wide presence online as well. And we saw Neni's book has also an online, a big website, and then the other book edited by Danai came out by Psyfi. There's a new publishing house headed by Christos Mais. So I wanted to put that aspect, because the island means enclosure, also means connections, and it means new types of thinking. So that's kind of almost heterotopic nod to these new publishers and new kind of groups and people that discuss these things in Greece and beyond. And goodbye from me. I mean, Christina and Maria will be.
So I'm just going to show the two books here for everyone to see. Once again, these are two books that have been at the center of Danais Karidakis and Enis Panourias presentations today. In conversation with Pausanias Karathanassis' insightful work on Moria camp. As it is always happens, you know, with great discussions, there is never enough time to address all the questions. So I'm just going to close, leaving one question as a food for thought, because I also thought I want to air it for everyone to hear. Unfortunately, we don't have time to answer it here, but we can carry it with us into our next meetings and daily lives as we go along. And the question is from Karl Mausi, who says, in many of your examples, the islands become spaces of oblivion as spaces of confinement or spaces of care for the Greek state and the EU. What can be said about the connections between the islands and time, or rather spaces outside, in brackets, a national time? So this is our food for thought, but also thank you for this wonderful discussion that we have been having this evening. Thank you to all three of our speakers, Neni Panouria, Danai Karidaki, and Pausanias Karathanassis. Thank you for all our audience members on Zoom and also on YouTube who have been following this discussion and also asking insightful questions. And thank you for our Torch team that have been supporting the network and the seminar series, and especially the tireless Ambara Khalidi, who is always with us supporting this broadcast. We hope to see many of you in our future events. There are quite a few planned for the upcoming year, and you will get to hear about them soon. And in the meantime, keep well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.